not being treated well inside of jail. They were not being given a fair trial. They are not being given their rights inside of that jail. People are even being denied the types of food that they need because of their ethical requirements inside of there, right? They are not being treated well by the government. So the only way to help this particular situation of reform and revolution is to tell people that the state is not all-powerful and you are not alone in fighting this. We think that how we do this in the best way is that we go in and we take out their emblematic people. We free their prisoners of conscience that actually emblematize their dissent, and we free them to allow them to continue to do what they want to do. We think this does a few things. The first thing that we think it does is it shows them that they're not alone in their fight. That the West isn't just all chat about human rights and free speech, but that actually we will stand up for your right to be able to ask your government for democracy. That we will stand up for the right for the people who you admire and the people who are trying to fight the fight for you to actually be able to fight that. But secondly, what we would say is that it demonstrates the limits of Russian power, which is one of the biggest problems in terms of revolutionary stuff and dissent inside of Russia today. We think that this is really important to be able to do, to empower those groups to continue to go on with their dissent. The imprisonment of the Pussy Riot was a massive blow to the movement, and we think the most important thing that we can possibly do to allow these organic groups to still gain power and empowerment is to basically free them. We also think it's important, and this is a very important point, Madam Speaker, is that currently, when Russia has internal issues, they try to demonize the West as being an external enemy that they can therefore legitimate repression with. The problem with this, once the West goes in and frees their dissenters, is that it's no longer plausible to say that the West is an external threat to the people of Russia. The West are the people who are freeing those people who are giving the Russian people a voice, right? We think it's very hard for the Russian government then to characterize the West as being in some way antithetical to the needs and desires of the Russian people. Go.
One of the ways that Putin maintains his power over the people is that they are safe. And I wonder, the SAS, the British SAS, actively get amongst their prisons, surely that is going to just confront that now.
No, so you don't understand. The SAS go in and they free the people who have been taken by the Russian government, are being mistreated by the Russian government, and represent them in dissent to the Russian government. They are not going in and in any way threatening the people of Russia. They are protecting their idols and icons. We think that is the best possible way of saying, Russia is not all-powerful, you are not in this alone, and we will stand with you. We also think it makes it really difficult for them to then use anti-Western rhetoric in general, because of the fact that the West is there trying to free their dissenters. Let's talk about how Russia will react, right? So the first thing we have to note is that we think that the way in which process and political change inside of Russia happens is generally through concessions. Throughout history, we've noticed, particularly in the USSR, is when internal dissent gets high enough and their capacity to repress them is low enough, at the point at which they are demonstrated to be weak, they try to engage on a set of concessions that allow to have basically evolutionary democratization and reform happen. We saw this with perestroika and the glasnost with the USSR, right? So what we think is that the people expect absolutely no less from their government when this happens, and that this is a very good way to gain a very peaceful transition when you allow this dissent to make the government do that. We also think that Putin will notice that it's probably in his interest to actually decide to give these concessions. We think it's a very logical conclusion of this. But we need to address something head on, because I don't want this to be a thing in the debate because it's silly. Why won't war happen, right? Why will Russia not wage war on the United Kingdom? One, Russia's military is actually in shambles. On the best day, they would not be in any way capable of taking on the United Kingdom, never mind to say that that would necessitate taking on the entirety of NATO, right? That is never, ever going to be successful for them. They are not going to do that, right? Secondly, what we would say is that this will actually be seen as the government going to war on the part of the church, right? Because what they are trying to do is defend against the people who are dissenting against the church being in bed with the government. That will not be a plausible thing that they can sell to their people as a thing that they should support. As a result, the internal problems will continue to exist, and they will be unable to actually facilitate and wage an external war on a practical level, right? So we don't think that's going to happen. We also just don't think that Russia has in any way vested interest into getting into an international conflict as a result of the freeing of a prisoner of conscience. We don't think that is plausible. So it's practically impossible, it is politically impossible, and it is not logical for that to happen. We think concessions will happen, we think reform will happen, and we are going to stand by the side of the dissenters and say reform has to happen in Russia now, you are not alone.
And to invite the leader of the opposition.
speech. Two of them we're happy to concede. Firstly, she says Russia isn't necessarily a nice place and Pussy Riot have a valid cause. We concede that. The second thing she does at the end of her speech is tells us why we may not end up with an international conflict. We'll concede that. What she does in the middle, though, is begins to actually hit the meat of this debate, which is essentially to turn around and say, how do we actually bring about that change? That's what we're going to tackle in our constructive. Firstly, we're going to talk about symbols of oppression, why that is only something that is achieved at the point at which Pussy Riot remain in prison, or at least we go through the process of things like court cases. Secondly, we're going to talk about sabotaging media coverage, why we change that narrative, and why actually Pussy Riot stops being the important incident at the point at which a bunch of people with guns storm a prison breaching state sovereignty. Thirdly, we're going to talk about breaking the liberal coalition, which is built up within popular media. We're pointing to things like Rolling Stone articles, but also amongst groups who generally support these kind of things. Almost all of my rebuttal will be interwoven. Before that, just like one thing in terms of this idea of like, we'll be freeing your dissenters. Three things on this. Like, firstly, not everyone supports the Pussy Riot. These are not all of the people's dissenters in a major way. Would point you to Putin versus anti-Putin riots that happened after the election of Putin most recently. We're not entirely sure why storming in is going to make these radical changes. Secondly, like, we think it's bizarre, this characterization that suddenly all of the dissenters love the West. Like when we say that a huge chunk of the narrative within Russia continues to be established upon the great bear that is Russia and their ability to continue to have some form of self-determination. There is some overlap between those two groups. The point at which the West comes storming in, we're going to alienate at least some of those people. That harms things like coalition building. Right, constructive. Firstly, similar oppression. Like, we think Pussy Riot are uniquely placed to act as a symbol of the cause, but that requires them to continue to be placed in prison, or at least going through the legal system. Several reasons for this. Like, firstly, we say that the general issue with these kinds of problems is that it is a very intangible harm in many ways that they are seeking to solve. When we start talking about battles between church and state, that is not something that is immediately tangible to me as a Russian citizen. We say the difference with something like Pussy Riot being in prison is pretty tangible when it comes to the restriction of the liberty and rights of the individual within Russian society. We say the point at which they are removed from that prison cell, that visceral element is fundamentally removed because they're not having their liberty removed in that same way. That symbolism is ultimately removed in a very real way. Secondly, when we look at the way that media ultimately works, we say, like, Pussy Riot are uniquely placed to capitalise on the shock value that is associated with their cause. Like, it's the clue is in their name, if nothing else. They are called Pussy Riot. Like, we say the important matter is that when they take shocking actions, like getting themselves in prison for their causes, when they become involved almost in these acts of martyrdom, we say that that kind of system is removed at the point at which we remove them from those prison cells. That cause begins to lose its importance and its validity in the eyes of the rest of the population. But thirdly, their placement within that state is of real importance because of the fact that they have an experience which is relevant to other individuals within that Russian state experiencing similar reductions in their liberty. We say that the point at which they're almost an acting government abroad is kind of the comparison you could make. We say the problem is their relevance decreases because they're no longer one of us, they're no longer in that state, they are external to it. Hugely problematic. When their importance is Pussy Riot as a symbol, we say you remove a huge chunk of that. Not just yet, I'll take one of you soon, don't worry. Secondly, sabotage of media coverage. Like, media coverage is great. It's really important for this cause. Three reasons. Like, firstly, like, continuing issues tend to go ignored. Like, you need the big incidents. Secondly, it's really good for coalition building. Thirdly, it's great for being a visible rallying point. The problem at which the SAS storms into a Russian prison and removes these people, then we have seen a change in that media narrative, which essentially sabotages the message of Pussy Riot. Several ways in which this occurs. Like, firstly, we say that media coverage is inherently incident-led, in terms of we look for big incidents occurring and we go to those incidents. The point at which the story no longer becomes about the continuing cause of Pussy Riot, we say that instead it becomes about the fact a bunch of armed men stormed into a building and took some people out. That's pretty big shock value, and that's the incident that we then report on. Secondly, when we begin to look at media bias, when we start looking at things like in terms of selling newspapers, etc., the focus is upon, no thank you, the most tangible and visceral element of a story, because that is the thing that is most easily relatable to another member of society. We say the fact that, like, knocking doors down and what have you is very tangible compared to, like, a continuing issue of relations between church and state. We think that the focus becomes upon that issue of national sovereignty and security, particularly in Russia, compared to the continuing cause of Pussy Riot, who are now living it up in Hampstead. Like, finally, in terms of this, like, Russian media, it's not all state-controlled, some of it is, but we say that they have a general incentive to actually follow continuing government main lines when it comes to, like, pushing sovereignty rather than pushing the cause of Pussy Riot at the point at which the SAS storm in will take place.
Does anybody think of the Russian legal system as anything less than a joke?
Yeah, okay, the Russian legal system can be seen as a joke often. Yes, good point. That makes the Pussy Riot supporters even more of a group of martyrs at the point at which they continue to sit in a system in which they can do nothing. Would give you Nelson Mandela. Like, furthermore though, we can continue to provide support to try and help them access things like rule of law, with like people like Amnesty International existing from a previous round. Finally, breaking the Liberal coalition. Like, ultimately, almost everyone has been on board with this in terms of people who would be generally considered as liberals in the rest of world society. The problem is, the point at which we start doing things like violating state sovereignty, that becomes exceptionally problematic for people to remain on board with that, both internationally and moderates within it. In terms of internationally, we say that often groups of liberals have a strong grip upon concepts such as self-determination. The point at which we are willing to violate the sovereignty of another state in order to interfere with its rule of law, that loses you those. But also moderates who continue to believe in some way in the self-determination of Russia within Russia, we lose the support of them at the point at which we remove that other liberal cause that they've got. We divide the liberal cause. For all of those reasons, I'm very proud to oppose.
Let's send up the speaker for the speech and to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case.
of dissent on the part of Pussy Riots, whether they are within or without this particular prison system, which is largely the only contention we get at the first opposition. Thereafter, I'm going to give you two substantive reasons as to why it is we think this will absolutely bring about both a geopolitical and domestic progress for Russia. In the first instance, because we think prisoners of conscience are a very important and useful mechanism for gaining imperatives on the geopolitical front for pushing for progress in Russia. Secondly, for a long time on, I might try to make a catch here later. Secondly, we think that it necessarily challenges the masculine culture of Russian politics, and why we think that given the current particular instances of oppression that are occurring in Russia, that particular form of dissent is most important and most apt with respect to Pussy Riot than any other representative. What are we given, though, by Pete? In the first instance, he tells you, I mean, not everyone sees the Pussy Riot as their dissenters, so they won't all absolutely rally around this cause. Well, he gives you one example to prove this. He says, I mean, weren't there anti-Putin campaigns as well as, or were there pro-Putin rallies as well as anti-Putin rallies? Yes. It's important in the first instance, Madam Speaker, to recognise that those are largely smaller, even though the people who were in the anti-Putin protests had the actual consideration of being shot, unlike people who were pro-Putin. So we think there's a substantive shift against the system of oppression which currently exists. Secondly, he says, look, they can be a better dissenting voice while they sit in prison and are forced to eat things which insult their ethical beliefs and are largely ignored and given unfair trials. Because, sure, aren't they in Russia? There's a couple of answers to this. In the first case, that would necessitate that being able to access a place or a forum to express their political beliefs. Not presently happening. Why? Because though in fact we can make it into their prison system, there so too stand guards who stop actual journalists getting into these people. So I think that's a problem, right? Secondly, we think that they presently have support, Madam Speaker, and don't and have had it before they were imprisoned. And the shock value of which Pete speaks has already occurred and already garnered a huge amount of international and domestic support. Further to this, if he thinks shock value is so imperative in garnering support for a movement like this, we can only think that men in uniforms in this particular instance would be just as shocking. I say men, but I agree with hoping for women. Then he tells us, right, in effect, that it's important that we disseminate this information, be disseminated perfectly. It's important to note that the single biggest fracture in the Putin prowess and Putin power at the moment of his stronghold has been a recent breakdown of his control over media. This is the single best time in Russian history to have this message both received and perceived by the Russian populace as being pro their interests and not simply an external force that hates them. Then they tell us, fourthly, right, that it'll seem like that the Pussy Riot will now seem like an external force because they'll no longer be in Russia. Like, first of all, like, how patronizing. Like, aside from the fact that Pete's case actually falls when reality tells us that significant rebellions have been led by leaders in asylum external to their countries. See the 79 Iranian rebellion led by Ayatollah Khomeini. Look at most of the Arab Spring, Madam Speaker. Look at the fact that most Russian people are well educated and aren't as pathetically futile as it is. The last speaker seems to condemn them for being because they aren't European, which apparently means British. Then we're going to talk about he says the best thing that they could do now, right, is to go through the court system. Fact one, they already have. It was a short trial, shocking that. Number two, Gibby's asking a point of information. Why do you think everyone thinks Russia's court system is a joke and it fluffs it off? Doesn't mean that it isn't a joke, Madam Speaker, and hasn't necessarily been unfair to them, and will continually be controlled by those with the most access to power, who aren't in fact in favour of them dissenting their present status. I have no idea of the time. Lastly, he tells you that you necessarily lose voters because people care more than anything else about self-determination. And this is the crux of the point that they lose the debate on. Because here's the problem, Madam Speaker. Not at present time do the Russian people believe that ownership of self-determination can be facilitated by their government. It is something onto which they can never, I think, have hopes, simply because their government denies that very notion of self-determination. See the rigged elections, which I know Ham didn't put in directly before or after that part of her analysis that perhaps seemed distinct for the last speaker, but those are in fact connected and important. Why do we think this will facilitate the progress which the last speaker concedes is, by the way, apparently the opposite prerogative also. They're not challenging that it's our duty to bring about that progress, they just think it's better their way. So, why do we think this is necessarily the best way to do it? In the first place, we think this is actively a government who understands shame and embarrassment as a tool for a change, for policy shift. Why so? In the first place, that's exactly the tool they chose to use against the Pussy Riot. They have shamed, they have unnecessarily admonished, and they have absolutely berated them into, I suppose, a position of no authority. Here's how we do a very similar thing, but in a more effective and useful way to our end. In the first place, the geopolitical conviction at the moment, it was against the imprisonment of these women. That's important insofar as that the message intended, that the message that the international position was is the same as the domestic one, and that's why it helps us in both cases to take this action. In the first case, if Russia do react as massively angered and don't afford further rights with respect to free speech, then they actively lose an opportunity to reassert some authority and to be in some way, and what's the word I'm looking for, reappraised by the same geopolitical community who they so utterly want to see them as a proud and important nation. So the first reason why we think it will help in terms of a geopolitical position. Secondly, though, we think, with respect to the domestic policy, if they act against Britain and actively deprive people of more rights with respect to freedom of speech or dissent, then they simply prove Pussy Riot's point. Nobody wants to make POI cool. And insofar as Pussy Riot's point was that they are in bed with the church, and more importantly, that they actively disallow any sort of alternative voice. So we think to that end, it also wouldn't serve their purposes of appearing above and in no way embarrassed by this situation. So we think in that case, there will be progress to be made, and there's certainly a coercive hand on our part of this. More importantly, though, or lastly, I think we would say that there has been a predominant I suppose, stereotype around an existing Russian polity which is played on a military and cooperative basis, which has always relied on the imperative for a strong armed government. It's one has rarely seen women dissenting and has lately actively taken aggressive steps not only to demean women's position in Russia, but also anything that is seen as effeminate. See the recent laws around in any way even publicising that you might be gay or endangering children with feminine likenesses or whatever else they explain gay and homosexuality away with. That active attack on female features or femininity and their position is one which we have to stop now. And we actively have an imperative to ensure that this untapped dissenting group of women see themselves as capable and allied with a stronger force in their same government to make them feel so powerless. For all those reasons, we beg you to propose the motion.
For her speech and to invite the next people from the opposition to do the first half.
Seems to be a big thing in this debate. The first prop want to get lots of traction from saying Russia's bad. No, it's really, really bad, and there's no other way to save these people. But what we say and what people do is this makes it incredibly worse when all of these issues that were previously being talked about and were previously being covered are ignored because the UK has committed an absolutely unprecedented attack on the issues of state sovereignty and Russia. We point to things that were so damaging to actually issues that were happening in countries, things like the Iranian hostage crisis, where you no longer now got examples of talking about actual issues of reform in Iran, but it was now about the US going in and being shit. I'm going to talk about two things today. I'm going to firstly talk about the reaction in Russia and how you're less likely to get change, particularly on the part of people who might have supported this. And then I'm secondly going to talk about the ability of Russia to reciprocate and why the creation of a norm of absolute state sovereignty is something that we like to support and particularly something we don't want Russia to have a precedent to be able to violate. Before I go on to do that, a few things are rebuttal. So first thing, notice that this is the entire premise of the first Rock case, that they say, the pro-Putin riots are smaller, like everyone is basically against Putin, so they'll be fine with people freeing the Pussy riots. That's actually just not true. There were pretty much equal clashes on the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg right after that happened. But even if that's not true, and even if these riots were in fact smaller, no thanks, Captain, the fact that Putin gained his political power from being seen as the protector of Russia, and the assertion of those pre-Soviet values that he asserts that Russian dominance, that's why people will then go and rally around him. Where do we see them rallying around, no thanks, particularly strong leaders, even though they have been weak and opposed? For example, in the 2004 election in the US, when George Bush was down, but Al-Qaeda released a video that highlighted the issues of how America was vulnerable, and even though he was bad, they rallied around that leader, and that's why they rally around Putin and will get more support. Secondly, then they went on to attack Pete's stuff about like an incident-less discourse, and they say, but hang on, this is like massive shock value, and it creates an incident. Firstly, their imprisonment is actually still an issue that is being covered in media. Pete pointed to things like the Rolling Stone example that had a Q&A with the Russian Pussy Riot activists that escaped at the end of at the start of September. The point is, people who are actually in the Pussy Riots aren't the only ones that can comment on the Pussy Riots. We can still have a discussion on these issues. Just to say we can't have any media discourse about this is absurd. What's the problem? Pete pointed that the specific incident now is about that unprecedented violation of Russian sovereignty, and we don't get a discussion about how terrible a place Russia is. Thirdly, they said, well, actually, that this will probably be seen as like pro-Russia, and they're doing stuff for Russia anyway, which is likely to be more supportive. Probably not. Pam actually gave you the analysis behind it when she talked about incredible anti-Western sentiments that do exist in Russia. The fact that the West has gone in and violated Russia's sovereignty and Russia's right to have its own determination on its judicial system is something that we think will be incredibly important. And that's the discourse that makes these leaders more popular. Then we got on to, she said, well, self-determination is important, then the Russian people need democracy, and that's why they like it. Yes, what's also important, and also a factor in self-determination, a right to control your own state borders, and that's the issue that we think we're focused on. Let's move on to my constructive about a reaction in Russia. We say it's of course true that democracy is flawed and the entire Russian legal and political system is flawed and in favour of the executive. The problem is that Putin and Medvedev are still actually incredibly popular among lots of groups in Russia, particularly those who you need to convince to get change in. What's the problem? The popularity of them comes from a reassertion of Russian greatness. And Pete told you of things like the Russian bear as an assertion of Russia's hyper-masculine values that asserts its right to dominance within its own spheres of influence that probably include Russia itself. Why is that important? Because we've seen this happen already. Like Russia wouldn't even reauthorize the UN peacekeeping mission in Georgia in 2007 because it regarded it as that within its own sphere of influence that it wanted to protect. So what happens? We think the violation of state sovereignty does two things. Firstly, we think it will create a rally around Putin as a strong, hyper-masculine figure that claims to be that protection of Russia. We don't think that's good for the Pussy Riots, no thank you. Putin recently actually came out and said this is a speech in Russia. He said specifically that if you're against if you're for the Pussy Riots, you are against Russia and you are against the values that Russia holds. That's why this is an issue of national unity, and that's the big thing that's created from that. No thanks. But also, secondly, you get less chat about the Pussy Riot, because now they're associated with that Western violation of that sovereignty, and they're able to be less influential figures of sport. Go for it, now.
Okay, cool. So the international community actually views sovereignty as an expression of self-determination, as we've done with the R2P and Humanitarian Convention. At the point at which the people in Russia don't see their self-determination being expressed by their state, why do they have sovereignty?
That's cool. The issue with state sovereignty and things like R2P is that has to go through a defined process to figure out where those violations have occurred. That's why it can be only things like genocide as authorised by the UN Security Council and done by that when we go in. What's not allowed? The UK to just go, this is something that goes against our morals and we can go in whenever the hell we damn well please. That's why it's of course different from things like R2P. That's just not an issue, guys. Secondly, why does this give the ability for Russia to reciprocate? Because what we say is this creates a precedent, no thanks Catherine, where it gives them an ability, it says, and it's okay to violate someone's sovereignty when it contravenes our moral principles and something that we hold. What's the problem? That position is incredibly and inherently subjective. And even if we all agree in this audience that these things should be something we support, lots of the Russian people and many of the people around the world just don't. Why is that important? It gives Russia an ability to use that precedent to violate other state sovereignty when you normalise that claim. Because they claim it's okay because the UK have done it to us when they felt it was something that they didn't like. But that's important because things like LGBT and women's issues aren't something that unfortunately are universally accepted around the world. First Prop said that obviously we're not going to get a war. We totally agree that you're not going to get a massive war that's going to happen over us. But what it does give greater credence to is a greater ability to Russia to establish its power over states like South Ossetia and Georgia, and particularly its influence in Syria, because now they don't have a claim to absolute state sovereignty. And when that unaccountability can't be challenged, and that's important when that action in and of itself gives them a claim and a precedent for being able to do this. Ultimately, Madam Speaker, we want to solve issues in Russia. We think they're horrendous and we think they're bad. But the UK and the SAS, a group of armed men going in to save the women, isn't going to do it. And for those reasons, we're very happy to oppose.
So can I proceed to invite the extension speakers to decide proposition to continue in this other.
Mr. Speaker, one of the biggest problems currently in Russian society, and indeed with a lack of Russian democracy, is an apathy in the Russian population. It's an unawareness of the kinds of oppressions that are going on. What we're going to bring you from closing this debate is an awareness of Putin. It's going to reveal how bad he is, and all of the stuff that they've talked about is actually a clarification of the oppression that he is committing against the Russian people. we're going to explain why this empowers opposition movements and why that's so good. Before that, 3 points. Firstly, Pete says, well, these guys are symbols of repression, and it'd be really bad if we let them go, because then they wouldn't be symbols of repression. Well, I just think, on some level, it's wrong to use them as symbols of repression. It's like it's their choice, what they do. Like, if we can free them, we should. You shouldn't just be using them as pawns in your game. But secondly, right, we would argue, and moreover, using them as pawns in your game is more likely for the West to be seen as like self-interest, right? But secondly, we would say that they're probably still going to be repressed to some extent even when they're free, right? And to the extent that they are, we would argue that most of your benefits, most of like the benefits of repression you talked about last would still. But if they're not, right, great, right? We're free to campaign. They're free to campaign, which means we win this case. You basically conceded this case. Secondly, we would say, Pete said, well, we can mitigate some of these harms to these people because we can provide them with legal access. Catherine's already made some jokes about that. But what we would say, moreover, is this completely undercuts the rest of your analysis, right, about those narratives of repression. Either you want to help them or you don't, right? You can't have it both ways in this debate. Thirdly, right, this notion that Russia are going to use narratives of Western incursions into their sovereignty as an excuse. Firstly, they don't need one, they do it anyway. But secondly, this is based on people believing that rhetoric. And what Catherine and Pam showed you very clearly is this is not a self-interest or self-motivated intervention. We're doing this for these people, we're going to use the language of that, presumably, and therefore people are going to believe this. Why wouldn't they, right? Like you're just creating an argument there in the paper that probably doesn't exist in the real world. Why then are we going to empower opposition and allow for the kinds of change that we need in Russia? The point here is not that we're trying to destabilise Putin per se. The point, however, we would argue, and will be clear, right, is that we're trying to at least allow opposition movements a chance in Russian politics, right? And when they talk about the Iranian hostage crisis, by the way, and that being a failure, that's not great, because the Iranian hostage crisis was a failure. This is manifestly not going to be one, so that analogy doesn't hold. So, recognise in terms of Russian society that Putin wants to make the issue, and has done this consistently. He wants to make the issue of Pussy Riot go away. He doesn't want people talking about it because it just makes him look stupid, and it makes, given like the nature and the ridiculing nature of what they produce, right? But moreover, the second you have to recognise that he wants this to not be a matter that he's like personally associated, and this is key to what we're going to talk about. The point, what he likes is a case where the Russian courts can make it, and it can seem like a legalistic decision rather than the political one that it actually is. We're going to talk about how we highlight that and how it's so good. Two scenarios in this debate. The first, right, is that Putin doesn't react, right, which they don't seem to really buy into, right, which is fine, in which case we get all of our benefits and none of your harms. The second situation is that Putin makes a massive deal about this, given that he feels he needs to take a stance in order to feel strong, right? We would argue, therefore, right, that there are a few benefits are going to result. The first is when he makes a massive deal, he talks and uses the language of sovereignty and whines and moans as they mention it. That is massively going to accentuate the profile of Pussy Riot and empower opposition groups, right? Because now they can be seen as a realistic opposition. Because at the point where Putin is scared of them, right, that implies he has something to be scared of and that they have some realistic chance. That's particularly important in Russia, a society where, as Pete concedes, there is state control of the media, and people don't know about these opposition groups and their credibility to some extent, right? So we say that's incredibly important in terms of alerting people the fact that there is a choice, right? That there are other people who you can vote for and protest for. But secondly, in terms of this, we would argue that Pussy Riot are uniquely placed as like jokers to take the piss out of Putin, right? Particularly given the way that Putin has this like macho cult of personality, which Pete recognizes means he's really strong. These guys are ridiculing, right? Yeah, so this is really important. They are the ones, like probably more than anyone else who can deconstruct this notion of Putin being this bear man, right? They are the ones who can make him look stupid, right? Because it's like, frankly, it's hilarious, given his rhetoric, that he can be beaten by a bunch of girls, right? That, given what he said, right, it's just like funny that this would happen. But yeah, it's just like when the lad, in the bar trips up in front of like a bunch of girls who've just been ridiculing. It's funny, right? And the point here, right, is a few things when we deconstruct this cult of personality. Firstly, we think that cult of personality is something that's used to shut down avenues of legitimate debate in Russia at the moment, right? Secondly, underpinning the kind of stuff that we heard before, right, when they mentioned anti-gay rhetoric, actually, always this kind of macho personality that explains why that happens in many situations, right? But thirdly, this just makes it far easier in a democracy in order to protest and be against someone who isn't going to paint himself as the father of Russia, right? It's far, far easier for you to make those arguments when calling yourself the father of Russia just makes you look like an idiot. Pete.
Okay. You don't think maybe when it's the SAS that like storms the Bastille rather than the Pussy Rioters that stormed the Bastille, it may be apparent that it was the guys with the big guns that were able to challenge Putin, not the people who were sitting in the jail cells.
Okay, right. We're going to free them, and then they can like do that, right? The point is not that they can do everything on their own, right? Clearly they can't because they're like locked up. And that kind of comes what you're saying about the whole legal access point, how we can actually change them. Look, what I'm saying is like we free them, right? And then they can do the work. We're not like doing it for them. They can make their own videos. They can take the piss out of Putin more. That's great. Finally, then, why this politicised conflict? Why that's so important? Putin, right? We think is going to be forced to take a stance on this issue, right? And that makes him personally connected. That's important because previously he's been able to detach himself from this, right? He didn't actually make any personal comment on whether or not they were involved. Right? Rather, what he did was he said it was out of my hands. It was the Moscow courts that actually decided it, right? This is important, right? Because now he has to clarify his position. So now he's going to either like allow them, like which fine, in which case all of our benefits accrue, or he takes a stance against these groups. Important for two reasons. Firstly, because it's a tangible example of the oppression that Putin causes, right? It's an example that opposition groups can use to stir people from the apathy, right? Can say, look, this is what Putin is doing to you. He's curbing your rights, he's putting you in prison, he's being anti-gay, he's doing all these things, right? This is what you need to change, right? And secondly, because it shows that to some extent, he is scared. And that the opposition groups are not just legitimate, but they actually have a chance of winning against Putin. Clearly, we show people that Putin is a worse person, and we actually make them act on that. Unless we do that, Russian society isn't going to change, and the Pussy Riot will stay in prison, and that's that.
Thank you for your speech, and to invite the side opposition to take the floor.
Here's the thing, guys. Russia needs three things in order to have any political change, in order to ever gain any of the democratic rights that it needs. It needs, besides the other, it needs to own its own change, its own revolution. Secondly, it needs to realise that democracy is the best way to do so. And thirdly, it needs to realise that the separation of the church and state is the best way to do so. You corrupt and you taint all three of these methods at the point where an external actor comes in to do this. That's going to be the first half of my extension. The second half of my extension is going to deal with the kind of extending what these guys very actually brought you about the idea of a symbol. We're going to look at weakness and why essentially these guys a lot of rebuttal to Freddy. Because here's the thing, because here's one of the first things that he said. He goes, well, like, we can't just use them as symbols and like let them, suffer, right? Because like we have a moral duty to do them. Nonsense. Like, why then are we not going in to rescue anyone in Russia? Why are we only specifically rescuing these people? Therefore, we must be doing so because of some other reason, and that we think that we can use them as a symbol. Second thing he says was the idea about how, in response to the case so far, that essentially what's going to happen is that, like, why the hell would Putin ever use these kind of, anti-Russian narratives of state sovereignty? Because they do it anyway. Man, we think that narratives become a lot more stronger at the point at which they become true, right? At the moment they're lies, now at the point where like the SAS actually stormed the goddamn gate, like Vladimir Putin can legitimately spin these lies and spin these narratives, and they've totally become true, right? The other thing he says is that Vladimir Putin isn't really personally involved in it so far, right? He's actually taken a step back. Nonsense. What he's actually done is he's lied about it, Madam Speaker. He said it was a specific opposition to the church. That is how, so far, like the kind of mainstream struggle has not gotten its like leg up, because he's actually been able to lie about it. We think that he's just going to be encouraged to spin more lies and actually press more people at the point where he intervened. Let's have a look and tell you about what they need to do. Essentially, one of the things here is they need the idea to own their own democratic change and own their own revolution. Right? Here's the thing, because people need to believe they actually have to kind of, in some way, be in conflict to the Russian state. That's absolutely important. That is what the Pussy Riot does. Essentially, what it says is that you can do this, right? Is that you can be part of your own democratic change because we are Russian, right? That's so important because Vladimir Putin is extremely powerful at spinning nationalistic narratives that overcome people's desire for democratic change. That becomes hugely, hugely, hugely important. Therefore, in order for any spark to ever ignite, this might be familiar because I'm pretty sure you were judging me in round 4, kind of the opposite of what I was arguing there. But anyway, because it's not a quick spark, right? People need to feel ownership of that, and we've seen that because the riots or because protests against Putin have exponentially grown since then. What happens now, right? What happens now is that when we actually externally take this away, is Vladimir Putin can say, look guys, revolution is not for you. Revolution is anti-Russian. It is a Western conspiracy. One of the main ways in which Putin, no thanks Catherine, one of the main ways where Putin can maintain his control over people is because people are still genuinely terrified of the West. That's kind of extending what these guys said, right? That is one of the main ways in which he can maintain power. Here's the thing. The second thing they need is actual democratic progress. Right, because we think that female rights, because as Catherine wanted to prattle on about how they're so good for female rights, that can only come through democracy. Don't make faces at me, right? That means sit down as well, by the way, right? Here's the thing. At the point where you need democratic change in order for this to happen, right? Why is that? Look at the UK and look at France. At the point where, women in France were only necessarily given the voting right, in the 60s. It takes time, and we accept that it will be a bit more of a long-term change. But it's not going to come instantly, right? That is why they need, that is why people in Russia need to believe that, democracy is the way in which they can overcome this, right? Why then does us externally taking this over harm that? Well, similar to the first thing. Because Vladimir Putin can spin the narrative. He spun it before that we were doing it against the church and not against him. We think it is very capable that he can now spin the narrative and say, look guys, not only is it not your revolution, but democracy is a Western conspiracy and you must fight against it because it will harm you as Russian. That's hugely important. What's the third thing you need? No thank you. Because one of the problems in Russia, particularly for women and particularly for people to maintain their own democratic rights, is anti-church imperialism. It's like the joining of the church and the state. That's been hugely problematic in Russia. Why is that? Because the church have been able to integrate itself into politics in Russia, right? That's really problematic. It can spend religious anti-feminist sentiments, and that genuinely convinces people that the church and religion is much more efficient in this way, right? So here's the thing. Yeah, go.
The problem is that your case rests on the ability for other people to forget their daily oppression once the Pussy Riot are no longer in prison, which seemingly
Right. Here's the thing though, because that's genuinely point 2. I know that's such a debating quip, but this is generally coming in point 2. We're going to look at why specifically they're going to stay in prison, and why that's much better. So as I was saying, right, and this applies directly to what Freddy was saying about opposition parties. Because now you can say, look guys, we no longer need the separation of the church and state. It can point to the United Kingdom, where it has quite a lot of secularism, right? And go, look, that once again is an anti-Russian conspiracy, right? It can point to these things that Russia so desperately needs, and it can say, it is not part of your national identity, you must deny it, and you must fight against it. That is extremely pernicious to the point where that is what Russia needs in order to maintain female rights and democratic rights for its people, and that applies to all religious parties. Here's what we can't afford to hear. Because what is it that the Pussy Riot do specifically while they're in prison? Because the very fact that they're in prison and they aren't getting treated particularly well and they aren't getting the right food and they're actively having to fight against the Russian government is exactly what these people need. Why is that? Because in order to overcome the absolute autocratic state that Russia is, you're going to have to take some short-term hits, right? You're going to have to suffer a little bit because it's a long-term change, right? People are terrified to do that, even though they don't realise because in the long term it's going to bring democratic benefits to them. What does Pussy Riot do? Because Pussy Riot is willing to take those short-term hits in order for that cause. It's a huge beacon of hope because it says, look guys, we can do it, you can do it. We're taking the short-term hit, you can overcome this, but you must not be scared to take that jump. At the point where you actively take that away from people, by making it an external thing, you do two things. One, the very fact that they actually gave up and they had to be rescued tells you that, you know what, it's too scary to fight against the Russian oppression. It's too scary to deal with it because all those short-term hits, all the things that the Russian government are going to do to you at the point where you're going to get democracy, is too scary and you should never do it. And secondly, it reinforces the idea that democracy is not for you and you're never going to be able to achieve it. So for all the reasons I gave, and what Tala did in some opus.
So invite the first of our summary speakers, summary of the debate. So
I'm a fresher. Me and my friends still laugh at the word pussy. Even the name shows it. Pussy Riot is an intrinsically funny institution. And we say, ladies and gentlemen, that that's what Putin needs. His cult of personality needs to be taken down a peg. We need to laugh at him. And satire is the best way you deal with cult of personality. That is why Pussy Riot is so important. That's why they need to be outside, singing their songs, doing their crazy games. That's why they need to be out, and that is why we're going to break them. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to explain two clashes. First, will this inspire pro-democracy movements? And secondly, will this embarrass Putin? And we say on both of these issues we win because the answer is yes. Now first, I'm going to do one small point of rebuttal. We had this idea why aren't you rescuing everyone opposition, and the opposition said, why aren't we rescuing everyone? Why don't we just go into every country? Well, first we think it's slightly implausible that we send the SAS literally everywhere. But also, we say, there's nothing to preclude going and helping other people, but we say this particular situation is really, really important. For the reasons we've already explained, we're not denying that it's just a generally good thing to do. 103, you can stand up. Okay. No. Okay. So now on to my first class. Inspire pro-democracy movements. Now, so we heard some analysis in the first prop about how it inspired pro-democracy movements. Now, the only response we heard, the analysis we got in the very first speech, was right at the end of the speech that we just heard just now. And it was that it'd be too scary. It'd be really, really dangerous and people wouldn't be pro-democracy because they're worried they're going to get shot. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's really obvious. If you go into prison, it's showing that the West is behind you. There's no downside to it. If you're a true Russian, if you're going in, the West has your back. Putin is the one who's not the Russian. He's the one who's actually against the people. He's oppressing everyone. And then we had this idea from first prop that it would lead to concessions, i.e. the Glasnost example. Again, this was an answer, so we assume it's true. Yeah. We assume there will be pro-democracy concessions. We had this idea that there'd be sabotage of media coverage from first off. This idea that the big thing wouldn't be the Pussy Riot struggle anymore, it'd be that the SAS broke them out. But we say actually that it's actually worse to be in jail. We say they get even less coverage in jail. The limited answer to that was, there was a Rolling Stone article. Yes, I know your point. There was a Rolling Stone article in which everyone heard their Pussy Riot. Well, actually, as my partner Freddy explained, that's not what Pussy Riot do. They don't do interviews. That's not the main thrust. The main thrust is singing songs. They're not able to sing songs if they're locked in a jail. We want them back in. We want them back. I'll take this out. We want them in the freedom of the ability to say stuff, and they can't say stuff when they're in prison because not you, him. Because as was explained before, you can't get journalists into cells like you can get grenades in SAS rooms.
Surely all the hilarity that all this is going to bring is pretty much over. And how the hell are they going to be so funny halfway across the ocean?
Well, apart from anything else, we say that assumes that they first off, comedy goes across borders. We think you can laugh at something even if you can laugh at someone even if they're in a different country. I find American comedians occasionally funny. But more importantly, there was this Ali Khamenei example, which actually wasn't responded to. The idea that you can actually lead a revolution from outside your country. It doesn't seem like that's been answered, and so we assume it to be true. And then, finally, this idea that came from Freddy. And this was the really important analysis. The idea that Putin doesn't want them shut out. Wants them shut out. And we didn't really hear an answer to this. We had this idea that it actually does Pussy Riot's work for them. Because if Putin has to say, oh my god, these guys, they've been broken out of prison, I'm not going to take another one, so don't bother. Then essentially what he's doing is he's publicising them on their behalf. And this wasn't answered by opposition, so we assume it to be true. And essentially what it does is it does Pussy Riot's job for them, it publicises their exploits, and it publicises the fact that they are now free. So it's very clear that this will inspire pro-democracy movements.
But the second question is, will this embarrass Putin? And we think that's very obvious as well. No, thank you. There was this argument about how it makes Russian power, like the limits of Russian power clear. I mean, if the SAS are able to go in and break out some people, like, doesn't that show that Russia's really, really, really weak? And that emasculates Putin. That makes him seem weak. And that was brought back by my partner's point, when he talked about how his entire cult of personality depends on the fact that he's able to secure Russian borders. But he isn't, because some guys with British flags are jumping into prisons and taking the people out. Prisons, the very things that are meant to be most secure in your country, are being invaded by a foreign force, and people are being taken out of them. That emasculates Putin, that makes him look like a pussy. No, thank you. And then, like, there's this idea that it shows that the West helps Russians, and it's like real Russians. Then we had this bickering, no thank you, about like, are there more pro-Putin people or more anti-Putin people? We say it doesn't matter. They don't need, we don't need to prove that everyone likes Pussy Riot in order to win this debate. We just need to prove that it inspires the people who do. And what we say, ladies and gentlemen, is that it clearly does. We had this idea about Western puppets, and that was mainly in third. And we had this analysis that they'll be seen as cronies of the West. That's crazy, because Pussy Riot are clearly famous for other reasons. They're not famous because they're pushed by the West. They sing in Russian, like everything that they do is about Russia. They're not pro-West. They don't sing songs about how nice the West is. They sing songs about freedom and how they want to be free, and how mainly about how Putin's an idiot, because he is. Thank you. No, no thanks. So what we say, ladies and gentlemen, is that that kind of argument only works. I'm not taking another one. Only works because people are from nothing and they are pushed into something by the West. Pussy Riot are already famous. They already are famous. They've had no support from the West. But actually, we're just breaking them out in a situation where they literally can't help themselves. A situation where they are in jail. Next, we heard this idea about anti-feminine rhetoric and how Putin defends on he depends on anti-female rhetoric and the emasculation. Again, it wasn't answered, but Freddy actually pushed it further by saying Putin's being emasculated. He's being shown to be the weak one by a bunch of girls. And then we heard this idea that it forces Putin to go into the issue, and that was what my partner brought to you. He said it's no longer a legal issue. It's no longer the courts have decided this. It's out of my hands, and I can't it's not my own personal decision. So I'm not the one who's making this this assault against freedom. But Putin is forced to get his hands dirty. He's forced to go into the issue and talk about it. But the answer we heard to this was, oh, Putin's lied before, so he can lie again. He lied about the church. We have two responses to this. First, it's got nothing to do with the church anymore. It's about people who are in prison and then being broken out. But more importantly, second, he did distance himself, and he never commented on what the judges said. Now he has to comment on what's happened. He has to comment on it, and he has to essentially be seen as the one who is guilty. So his lies in that instance no longer serve any purpose. They no longer work. Ladies and gentlemen, breaking Pussy Riot out of prison will do two things. It will inspire pro-democracy movements, and it will embarrass Putin. And for those two reasons, we stand proud in proposition. Thank you.
Speech, and to invite the second of our summary speakers to summarise the case of opposition and the debate as a whole.
First one's going to be about how this actively harms democracy. Second one's going to be about this idea of the Pussy Riot and their roles as heroes and symbols and stuff like that. First of all, a couple of points of rebuttal don't quite fit into my speech. Right? First of all, I've been sitting down there over there, right, and I've been listening to this chat about how we can make Putin look stupid because of the fact that he's been defeated by a bunch of girls. First of all, I'm going to prove to you in my second point why that's actually not true. Second of all, even if it was, surely that's far more harmful to feminist narrative at the point at which you're saying oh, it doesn't matter what they've stood for, it just matters the fact that he's been beaten by a bunch of girls. We think that's just a little bit of an offensive idea. So we think that's a little bit stupid. Secondly, as Joe brings in in his POI, right? He talks about this idea that the comedy's over, right? And we've had as much popularity as possible, right? So first of all, what Joe said, right, is that they're not funny once they're removed out of the equation. And second of all, even if they were, right, the fact is all the buzz that the Pussy Riot have managed to incite through their being in prison is undone, because they are just the people now who took a stand and made some jokes and then kind of ran away and got taken away to safety and never came back. I think that's a really bad thing for the image about what they did. It kind of has undone all the good work that they did, right? So let's get on to this idea about democracy and how this actually harms.
thanks. So this is what Bill really brings out in his extension, right? So he talks about this idea that they need to own their own change, right? We think this is really important, right? Because this idea, like, as proposition have said at one point or another, I can't remember who said it, the change needs to come from within, right? So, like, yeah, so even the prop son, just there in his speech, talked about this idea that, like, oh, the Pussy Riot stand for more, like, stand for things other than the West because they're Russian, right? Like, yes, like, we think the fact that they're Russian is exactly why it's so important that they remain in prison. Because we think the fact that, like, the fact that they're Russian symbols of what the oppression is particularly important, because that's how we start the change from within, is by letting them, kind of staying there. Okay, so, yeah. So we think what happens is that when the West comes in and takes them away, right, we think that you actively associate this movement, like the movement that they have started, with the West, in the eyes of both Putin and with the people. Why is that harmful, right? Okay, so first of all, we think that, as Joe points out, it fuels this kind of anti-West sentiment, and we got a little bit of it from opening as well, right? And it turns people off from fighting, because if they don't like the West, like, then if the West come in and, like, come in and take their symbols away, then they're just kind of like, well, now this is becoming like a Western thing. I'm not sure I really agree with it so much anymore, right? So I think, like, we heard from opening prop, like, this idea that, like, people want their right to self-determination, right? Like, we think that's perfectly right, but we think they want their right to self-determination. We don't think that they want their, like, they want the West to come in and dictate to them, like, what they think is right and wrong. Especially, by the way, Madam Speaker, considering the fact that, like, Russia has particularly, like, long-standing ideological differences with the West, like, see the Cold War, see all these other different things, right? We think that they're less likely to take on the specific messages that Pussy Riot started, at the point at which that actively becomes associated with the West. We think that's a really bad thing. No, thank you. So, like, the second harm we get from this, right, is that and Joe really explains it really well, is this idea that it feeds into Putin's narrative, right? So, I think what happens is, it first of all allows him to say that we're kind of meddling, and it pushes us away from progress, because, as I said, it fuels anti-Western sentiment, which he then is free to exploit, right? But secondly, like, right, if we keep getting this idea that it's going to embarrass them, right, we say, like, actually what happens is it just makes him angry, right? And it allows him to kind of swoop in as this kind of protector, where he says, like, look, the West are coming in and invading us, because actually, technically, that's what they're doing, is they're just swooping in without any permission, right? And it allows him to furthermore, as Joe said, I'll take one of you in a minute. Furthermore, as Joe said, right, it allows him to lie further, when he initially lied about by trying to blame it on the church, right? So we think that what this proves is that Putin is showing that he's particularly successful at spinning narrative against the West and spinning narrative in his favour. We think that there's no reason why he's not going to be able to do this. I'll take closing.
Doesn't breaking them out force Putin to do what he wants to avoid, talking about his opposition and legitimising it?
No, I don't think so, because, like, as I said, right, at the point at which Putin's opposition is seen to be the West, it becomes so much more illegitimate in the eyes of the people. So we don't think it actually does. We think at the point where the opposition is within, as in with the Pussy Riot Girls, like, or a movement started by the Pussy Riot Girls, because they remain in prison, we think that it's far more likely to get him to have to stand up and talk about it, because there's no association with the West that he can kind of fall off the problem. Right. Secondly, this idea of, like, the Pussy Riot Girls and their rules, right? So, okay, so, like, we heard, like, in the very first lecture in Pam, right, we heard this idea that, like, they are the icons of Russian descent, right? Like, and they need to show that they're not alone in fighting. Like, we absolutely agree with this, right? So we think, like, we got from opening up, right, we got this idea that, like, the restriction of their liberty is a symbol for the restriction of the liberty of the people. We think that, we absolutely agree with that. However, like, more than that, we think that what happens is, at the point at which you remove them, you remove the point of hope of the people, because we think they're a symbol of, specifically of fighting. This is what Joe brings you in his extension, right? So we think that, like, when they leave and go off to safety, no thanks, right? We think that the people in that country who previously supported them now start to feel, like, abandoned and alone, right? Because, like, let's face it, if they get taken away and taken to safety, it's not likely that they're going to come back to Russia now that they've been slammed in prison. We think that they just go away and they're never seen or heard of again. We think that massively harms, like, this idea that, like their position as heroes and their position as martyrs. Like, you know, see Nelson Mandela and all the other examples that we brought about in the debate. No, thank you. Right. So, secondly, right? So we got no thanks. So we got this idea from Bob, right? They said it's immoral to do it. Like, first of all, from opening, because they're being treated badly in prison, right? Like, first of all, we say it's good that they're being treated badly in prison. All the better, Madam Speaker, because we think that what happens is this actually makes it even more heroic. It makes it even, like, it highlights even more the problems with the system, because it highlights this idea that, like, Russia doesn't treat people well. We think that that's actually like, better. We think that if they were sitting in a 5-star hotel, Madam Speaker, they wouldn't have nearly as much power as heroes. Okay? So Joe takes this down, but I'm just going to reiterate what he said because it was really good, right? So, like, first of all, we think at the point at which they're willing to go to prison for their cause, like, they probably don't care that they're going to have to stay in prison for the cause. We think that they're probably going to accept that, and they're probably going to be really happy, like, that they're continuing to act as a symbol for the fight. We don't think that they're going to be that bothered that they're being used as pawns, right? Okay, so secondly, we think that, like, the people are much more likely to relate to them and feel inspired by them, and as Joe tells you, give them the confidence to start standing up and questioning Putin's views, and allow a slow but steady, like, idea of change and stuff like that to progress. So for all these reasons, for the reasons that Joe and